Welcome to Into Theology. We have been meeting weekly, and this is the next week's
When
podcast.
is the last time you and I actually did a podcast? Like
Probably
April?
May. I
May?
don't actually know, but probably May because I did one with Ryan like 5 weeks ago, and then we're like, oh, we'll just meet next week, and it
Yeah.
didn't happen.
It's I'll say, man, I appreciate your patience with me though. Like for those who are listening, I won't get into all the details, but my dad died in April. My mom had to go into long-term care around then too. And so I'm now back up in Canada right now, just dealing with all kinds of stuff here. It's just been crazy. So I just haven't been able to jump in on this, but super thankful for Ryan hopping in. Ryan Hurd, obviously a much more intelligent
Better
podcast
co-host, actually. I
host.
don't
Probably not as funny and certainly not as good looking as me.
know for it's
But
true. Yeah.
nevertheless, I'm glad. And I was like, I totally had FOMO the whole time, you guys. I was listening to it, and I was like, oh, I wish I was in this. So hopefully we can get Ryan back on the podcast and do some more Thomas. But I'm excited to get back into it.
Uh, the only problem with Thomas is that he doesn't believe that the Bible has authority for all people.
Here we go.
So I don't know if I don't know if we can continue.
I feel like this is like some bad joke that we just make all the time, you know. But we
The same
sort of
joke
need
every
to
week.
because people keep saying it, and you're just like, have we not made fun of you enough to know that like this just needs to stop?
Yeah, it is. Some people think that Thomas existed after the Protestant Reformation, uh, and it shows.
Yeah.
Anyways,
Well,
we're
I mean, but think about it. It's interesting, right? Like
yeah,
thinking, given the topic that we're going to be talking about today, we're going to talk about the
find
simplicity of God,
simplicity. Yep.
question 3 from our Peter Kreeft version, so page 73. Um, but it is weird, right? That like what 100 years of Protestant and Reformed works in theology and doctrine of God, nobody really talks about divine simplicity, and now it's like all anybody can talk about. It's
Right.
just it's weird how that works with theology, right? Whereas like something very fundamental can just be forgotten. You tweeted recently about how is it that people just cannot understand, like, what was it? Was it unified operations or something like
Right.
that? I
Right.
can't,
Inseparable. Yeah.
inseparable operations. And it's like it's another one of these things that everybody's talking about now. Nobody
Right.
was talking about it. Even like for us, it's like none of us were talking about it 10 years ago. Now it's all the rage. And Thomas Aquinas is the big guy and all this stuff. It's just everything is fads and trends, it seems like. It's just, why can't we just do theology?
You know, it's funny you just said that. I've been thinking about this lately. This might be a too like pious of a thought, but I'm sorry.
You
I'll get more
pious?
inane and silly soon. But life is crazy with ups and downs, and it's
Tell
hard.
me about it.
You know for sure. And It's so easy to like get locked into all these other important things that are truly important. But then, if God is who we think He is, theology is simply trying to listen to Him really carefully so that you can know Him. And it's
Yeah.
like if God is truly our Creator, our Heavenly Father, and our goal is to return to Him, it really does make a lot of sense to spend time, maybe not, you don't have to be an academic, it's not my point, but just thinking carefully about what God has to say to us. And it's maybe more important than we think. But it's a bit of an uphill battle because you use words like inseparable operations, but like 1600 years ago, that was just a normal talk. It was just everyday kind of speech ish. And all it was just saying is, look, when the Father acts, so the Son acts. If you read John 10, John 14, you already know this, or John
Yeah.
14 in particular. And John 5, maybe John 5 is more straightforwardly. So you just know this. Whatever the Father does, the Son does too. Or whatever the Son does, the Father does too. And the point is that they both are divine. Like, that's it.
Yeah.
And it really helps you to think through who God is. And yeah, it's just something you kind of forget, even though that's one of the main arguments for why the Son is included in the definition of God. Then divine simplicity is like, well, it's why God, Hero Israel, are the Lord of God, the Lord of God is one. Why is He one?
Yeah. Right.
Like, what
Yeah.
does that even mean? I am who I am, He says in Exodus 2. Like, who who is this one God? And part of the like, not the whole answer, But part of the answer is he must be simple, which means he's not composed of all the sorts of things that you and I are composed of. He doesn't have chin hair plus a nose, you know. He doesn't have eye, plus a fingernail or something.
I think you're quoting Thomas there, right? On the first article.
He actually does talk about body parts at one. I don't know if I'm actually quoting him.
No, obviously.
Okay. Like, maybe I was. He doesn't quite talk as eloquently as I do. But I think it's just really important to do theology, because if God is who he is, yeah, it's not economically good for you per se. It doesn't really make as much sense, but it's, as a great philosophical thinker of our age recently said, Andrew Tate, that reading books, he has profane language I won't quote, but reading books is for stupid people.
That makes sense.
And maybe, but God revealed himself in a book, and I've thought that God is a smart being.
Yeah.
So maybe there's something to the book that isn't. It's crazy that he's like a Muslim now, and he's like reading books.
Is he?
Yeah, he converted, but then he thinks reading books is stupid because you do have holy books, anyways.
It's called the Quran.
Yeah.
Don't pay
Quran.
attention to this guy. What an idiot.
So one of the things I want to say about the simplicity thing is it's interesting. It's the third question in his Summa. But part of the reason he's doing this is because the genre of doing science at his time said that you first need to establish a subject exists, which he's already done, and then explain how it exists. And so he's kind of explained how God exists, as it were. Like he's moving into this. So it's not so much it's just the standard order. It's like if you write an essay, you have like an introduction paragraph, and then a thesis statement, and then supporting points and a conclusion. So the order that he's giving theology is just an order of how people organize thinking in his time. So I think it helps to explain, because you're like, why would simplicity be front loaded? Because simplicity is a little more of a philosophical doctrine rather than it being like a Bible verse doctrine, like the earlier questions were like on the existence for God or the science of theology. But I think it's important to note that he's just doing what's the obvious thing to do for a field of learning.
Yeah. He's given these proofs, the 5 ways, in the second question, and now he's in the third, and he tells us right off the bat in the very opening section, like he's basically saying, listen, I've shown you that he exists. Now I'm going to tell you what this existing being is as best we can, right? So he says, when the existence of a thing has been ascertained, there remains the further question of the manner of its existence, in order that we may know its essence. And so he's basically saying, okay, I've given you the 5 ways. Here's why we believe that this exists as part of this whole science of theology. And now he's going to tell you what this existence is, the manner of existence. And he's going to say, to get at its essence, right? Like we want to know the causes of things in order to know the thing itself. But he's like, but we got a problem, boys. Next section now, because we cannot know what God is, but rather than what he's not. We've no means for considering how God is, but rather how he's not. And so simplicity is then setting the stage for, what you might refer to as the negative names, and then the positive names and things like that of God or his attributes. And this whole idea of like, okay, so we're showing that he exists. Now we're going to start talking about his actual nature. But guess what? We can't actually speak directly to it. And so simplicity, he starts off with simplicity here because that's like the way in a way. It's a negative name in that it means that he's not composed. He's uncomposed, not made up of parts. So that's why it's negative. And something that's a simple being has no parts. Sometimes, and that's why I think in the first article he jumps right into whether or not God has a body. But simplicity is more than just like, okay, God doesn't have a body. That's why he doesn't have parts, because he doesn't have a body. It's like he's not a composite of anything. Like there's no composition of God whatsoever. Even in relation to things like essence and existence, there's no composition of form and matter in God. There's no matter. There's just pure form and things like that. So it's like you can see like why this particular question has to be front loaded in order then to really kind of like make sense of
it's really the first question you can ask. Like what's God made up of is really the first question you can ask. Like, what is a human? You think, okay, well, it's like flesh, blood, soul, whatever. Cars, metal, and pistons, and so it's like, so what is the stuff that God is? You really got to ask that question, and the answer is not really any stuff.
Exactly.
So that
So
is
how can you speak of him? Well, you have to
yeah.
speak of him in this negative way or in an indirect way or something.
And now there'll be later theologians, Reform guys, who will distinguish between how God knows himself, archetypal theology, how God is known by us, archetypal theology, and there's this idea of analogical knowledge and so on. But everyone agrees. Just for example, Gregory of Nyssa says, what is it? No, Gregory of Nazianzus says the first thing you need to know about theology is you can't name God.
Yeah.
Now, he doesn't mean biblical names. His point by name in that context, he means know exactly what God is and fully express him in like a word. And that's why the Bible reveals God in so many different words and images and pictures and names, because God is so immense that we can only know him in part by part by part. And we grow in that knowledge. And as we grow in that knowledge, we move from one level of glory to another as we, 2 Corinthians 3, look on the face of God in Christ. So that's important. I'm glad you read that, by the way, because we were so out of practice, we forgot that you're supposed to read a portion of
Oh, yeah.
of what we're supposed to do. So let's jump into the
I
first
knew what I
question.
was doing.
You know what you're doing. Yeah, you got it. So whether God is a body. Now, this is a really weird and interesting question because I'll be careful because so someone I know
Not
somewhat
me.
recently argued, God has a body. And I'm like, well,
Somebody argued this recently?
yeah, I won't say too much because it's someone I
You
know.
tell me after.
Yeah, and it's like,
I'll tweet it.
okay. And then, but like no theologians, no one believes this in history, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
So we don't,
Manichaeans believed
yeah.
it.
Well, yeah, sorry. No Orthodox.
No
And then it's like,
Orthodox.
and there's, or the anthropomorphisms persons, whatever that word is.
Yeah, but
Um,
anthropomorphic.
and more fights, I guess.
Anthropomorphites, yeah.
Yeah.
Something like
And then part of the conversation I remember went something like this where, well, you don't actually know what people believe because all we have are the writings of the elites. So what did actual people, Christians
that.
believe? You're like, I just remember being so like, I don't even know like what's happening. What world do we live in right now? And then yeah, I mean, but I kind of get it because the Bible does describe God in like even Thomas quotes, I think, Kings, where God has dimensions. So he's heights and depths and width and so on. So if he has these, is he not some sort of body? And it's not just like ours, but is there some sort of thing to contain him? Tertullian in Ad Praxian and also in De Anima speaks of God having a body, but to clarify, Tertullian always believed God has a spiritual body that does not correspond to a material body, but he uses that language to describe the soul the soul actually in De Anima, and then also God in Ad Praxian. So there's a sense in which you can kind of see even an intelligent person maybe kind of think of God having some sort of spiritual body.
Yeah.
And yet, except for him, I mean, after him, everyone's like, nah, dude, that's off. And especially Augustine and others will begin to say, oh, seeing like when you think of God as having a literal body of like flesh and blood or something, it's I don't think Augustine says it this way, but I'll say it this way. It's almost like you're just thinking of like the pagan gods, like
Yeah.
Zeus, which is exactly what the apologists beside and before Tertullian argued. They're like, if you think that our God is passable, has flesh and blood and bones like Zeus and Hercules have, like that's not the God of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so simplicity, or in this case, impassibility, which is actually very close to simplicity, is a way to say God is not like the pagan gods of this world. He's something completely different. So, I mean, it's a live issue that I think people do sometimes think, well, maybe God does have a body.
I mean, I remember talking to somebody, again, I won't name names, but a mutual friend of ours, and this is a long time ago, like 20 years ago. And I can remember somebody who I had trusted theologically and whatnot had argued back based upon the fact that humans are made in the image of God. And because of that's how we're made, therefore God must have a body because humans have bodies and we're made in his image. And I was like, whoa, no, that's not good. you know?
Actually, and the crazy part is that people are not saying that bluntly, but that's sort of the new image of God theology stuff today is really pushing for embodiment stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's very worrisome, but I don't want to get into that here. But yeah,
We'll get into it because it's going
yeah,
to come up right in the Summa. But I mean, yeah, the other group that we want to think of today would be Mormons. Mormons believe
Oh
that
yeah,
God has a body,
good point. I didn't
and
think about that.
what Thomas does when he does his I answer that on page 75
Yep.
to the question of whether or not God has a body. What he argues here, in my mind, is one of the best places to go to refute Mormon theology or LDS theology. I've done this with Mormons when during COVID they were very aggressive on Facebook, and so I get into these. I was actually like zooming with these Mormon kids, elders, and I basically kind of was using what Thomas was doing here. I'm like, the universe can't exist if your theology of God is true. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, because why? He says, I answer that. It's absolutely true that God is not a body, and this can be shown in three ways. First, because no body is in motion unless it be put in motion, as is evident from induction.
Induction.
Right now, it has already been proved that God is the first mover and is himself unmoved. Therefore, it's clear God's not a body. For God to be the first mover, nothing can move him, and it's things that have bodies that are put in motion. And so he's like, he can't have a body if he's the first mover. You can't have, like, in my mind, that's what I said to these Mormons. I'm like, you can't have like a universe, you can't have a first uncaused cause on your view. Like, how does God bring the universe into being? They basically have a view of like an infinite regress of gods, which again is absurd, but like,
That's almost a denial, like essentially a denial of creation from nothing.
yeah, they don't have a creation from nothing. Yeah, they
Uh-huh.
basically believe the universe is eternal and that there's no such thing as spirit. It's like a refined
That's
matter.
so Tertullian has a whole book on, I think, against Homogenes, I think's his name, who basically has this view of eternal matter and creation from nothing, or ex nihilo is the fancy word. It's like that's a pretty central teaching of Christianity, that
Yeah,
there was
it's the
nothing
opening of the
before
creed.
God. He's it. And I mean Genesis 1, I think. But by the way, I want you to keep reading, but I should also note his on the contrary begins with a citation of John 4:24.
Yeah, God is spirit.
Yeah, I just want to note that because he says, okay, so authority, because remember we have to go back to the early chapters. Authority says God is spirit, so boom, he has no body.
Yeah,
But it's actually because Jesus doesn't explain why, you know, he just says it. Here's why it makes sense. So what he's doing is
yeah,
making sense. It's that's kind of doing theology.
yeah. He's just using reason, and it's like there's not. You don't have to. You can pull text obviously from scripture, and then that's what he's doing in his on the contrary, as his authority. But then he's showing this is why this is actually reasonable to believe this of God too, right?
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
here you have like pagan philosophers like Aristotle basically telling us the same thing because reason can tell you this, and it makes most sense. All right. So in the second one, he says it was for three ways to show that God's not got a body or not a body. So the second one gets all funky with this like weird Aristotelian language here. So I'm gonna ask you to unpack it so I don't have
Oh
to.
boy.
But secondly, because the first being must of necessity be in act and is in no way in potentiality. For although in any single thing that passes from potentiality to actuality, the potentiality is prior in time to the actuality. Nevertheless, absolutely speaking, actuality is prior to potentiality. For whatever is in potentiality can be reduced into actuality only by some being in actuality. Now, it has been already proved that God is the first being. It is therefore impossible that in God there should be any potentiality. But every body is in potentiality because the continuous as such is divisible to infinity. It is therefore impossible that God should be a body. So he's arguing basically in terms of the two types of ways that like act and potency relate to each other in terms of priority in time, and then priority in terms of what's doing the moving, or something has to be an act in order to make something that's potential become
Yeah,
act.
and I
What
think
is act? What is act? What is
yeah,
potency? Like, what does all this
I think
mean?
probably the easiest way, like, so potency is just power, the ability, the capacity to do something, and act is just doing it. So all of us have the ability to like jump, but we don't jump unless we choose to do so. So we might say our mind is prior to the power to jump, and we jump. But the point, I think, it is a bit complicated, the language he's using, but I think the straightforward way to put it is, um, God has always been fully doing what he's doing. He didn't just become good one day, or
Yeah,
choose to be good one day, or choose to do something. He's always who's always been. He's always acting as he is. He always so you might say he has what's the language that's used? It's like active. It's not. It's active potency. It's
Right.
not passive potency. It's
Yeah.
God is
Yeah.
always who he is, and he's never not who he is. He always does what he is, and he never doesn't do what he is. Whereas humans, like the Bible says in Psalm 119, I believe, verse 68, God is good and does good. Or I think it's Psalm 145 that goes on and explain that God does good to everyone. So why does God do good? It's because he's good.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
God, that's the same thing.
Yeah. Everything's one.
There's no distinction. But for you and me, those are two different acts. Like
Yeah.
we have the power to be good, but we have to actually choose it and follow through with it. And
Yeah. It has to
sometimes
be
we choose
actualized.
evil.
Yeah. It has to be actualized in us. Right.
Sometimes we fail to actualize the capacity for good, and we, in fact, not only fail to actualize it, we pervert it or corrupt it. So I think what's being simply put here is that God is always an act, so he can't be a body, which can be both an act and not an act.
Yeah. And then the third is kind of like it sounds a little like perfect being theology, maybe. But the idea is that
Spooky.
yeah, God is the most noble or perfect of beings. Now it is impossible for a body to be the most noble of beings, for a body must be either animate or inanimate, and an animate body is manifestly nobler than any inanimate body. But an animate body is not animate precisely as body, otherwise all bodies would be animate. Therefore, its animation depends upon some other thing, as our body depends for its animation on the soul. Hence, that by which a body becomes animated must be nobler than the body. Therefore, it is impossible that God should be the body, because he's the most noble or he's the most perfect of beings. So if he's the highest degree of perfection, it just means he can't have a body.
Yeah, and I
Because
think this one's easier to understand if you think everyone says mind over matter. If you feel like you're tired, you can push through it. And the point
yeah,
is that you have something inside of you that can overpower your tiredness or your laziness or whatever it is. And what he's getting at, that's more noble. And he's not saying like the body's bad. He's just saying because you can be tired and push through it by soul, by choosing to do it.
yeah.
You can, like David Goggins does every day on the grind. Um, because you can do that, there's obviously something more noble, something has a higher, that's has more authority, it's prior to. But that's part of what it means to be a composite being, and God's not that.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's like making a comparison between like a human, a dog, and a rock.
Yeah.
The rock is a body, but it doesn't have any kind of soul, nothing that acts upon it that way. The dog has the soul, so it's got a sensible soul, not a rational soul, but
A woof
nevertheless
soul.
a wolf soul, and so it's better because it's better than being a rock because something animates it.
Nobody
Humans
has a
then
few people have a pet rock, most people have a pet dog.
right, but like then the human soul, higher degree of soul is the rational soul than the dogs. But all this is this, so there's like these gradations, and then to have the highest though would require it to not have a body, and just to be kind of like pure soulishness or something immaterial, and so therefore, because God's perfect, he's the most noble. It just means that he can't have a body, because that would mean it would be something lesser than.
So then he goes to this whole list of these different kinds of compositions: matter and form. Matter is
Yeah.
the stuff, the form is the shape of the stuff. I mean, it's actually not quite that simple, but for the purpose of I have to leave in like 6 minutes, let's just make it that simple. Uh is this God is the same. There's a couple things I want to note. So essence and existence are the same in God, but for us they're distinct. That's pretty important for Thomas. That's the fourth article on
Yeah,
pages 78, 79.
yeah. He is his own existence. He doesn't look outside of himself
Right.
like we do. We look to him for our existence. That's why I have an essence as a human being, but my existence is not dependent upon me. I'm contingent because God is not contingent. He's a necessary being. He therefore has to be his own existence. It would be nonsense if he was a necessary being and had to look outside of himself for his own existence, because he's always been. His essence and his existence have to be the same thing.
And that's why all creatures participate in God in the
Yeah,
sense of we exist but we're not existence itself. God
Yeah,
gives us
fundamental
existence.
to us is our existence. It's the bedrock. It's our being. But again, it's contingent being, and it's weird because it's like the first thing that the intellect knows is the existence of a thing.
Right.
Its being, and
And maybe like the simple way to put it, because some of this language is old fashioned, is to say like all creatures rely on God. So participation, all that kind of language sounds fancy, but in essence, it's saying because God is existence itself, he gives us existence. So
yeah,
it's all derived from him. We're not autonomous islands on our own, but all of us owe something, all owe our very life to God.
yeah,
And it's just more philosophical language and more common back then to talk like that. Whereas today, maybe we don't.
yeah.
The form of matter, I should just a really kind of just bizarrely nerdy thing. The form of matter thing's interesting because I think it's Karl Rahner who talks about God, the Word, being the quasi-formal cause of the flesh of Christ.
Oh,
Really fascinating.
okay.
We don't need to get into that. I just thought it was nerdy and I should bring it up. Is God altogether simple? The primary matter thing actually at the very end is kind of what we were talking about earlier. So primary matter could be just stuff that's, before.
It is funny, right? Like when we in the modern kind of like cool kid discussions about divine simplicity,
Yeah.
it seems like everybody goes to the seventh article, number on page 83, as like here's what simplicity is, and then just kind of leaves it at that, which I mean is obviously important. The whole idea that like God being altogether simple. Why? Because he's not made of parts, he's not made up of anything, he's not composed. um but you can see from the whole of question 3 and all the various articles involved in it that it's more than just the fact that he doesn't have any kind of like parts to him, that he's altogether simple. It's more than that. Like God doesn't, as he says in the 6th article, he doesn't have any accidents. Not that God doesn't trip and fall. As accidents, there are these qualities that attach to essences, that can change, that are
God doesn't have
expressible.
short hair that becomes long hair.
Yeah, like the accidental. I was illustrated with a ball. It's like, if you have a ball, it's the what makes it the ball is that it's round. That's an essential property of the ball. It could be blue, green, or red. If you change the color, it doesn't stop being a ball. If you start to cut the ball and make it into a square, it's no longer a ball, it's a square. But you change the color, all you're doing is changing an accident. The blue, the red, or the green are all accidental properties that can change, that doesn't affect the essence. But God doesn't even have accidents. He's
No.
just, he is being itself, ipsum say.
Actually, the 8th article at the very end is really important because this is relevant today. Like, does God enter into the composition of other things? And you might say, like, does God come into the world that we live in and just attach himself to things and respond to things and change with things? But that can't be true if he's simple.
Yeah.
That is not possible.
Yeah, this is where he has a go at this guy, David of Dinant.
Poor David
Um,
of Dinant.
that guy, he got he got lit up in the Middle Ages. But yeah, this is where you get Thomas as being most insulting. This is always like one of my favorite parts of
Although
this.
it's like he just said he has an absurd view. That's
Yeah, like
literally
who
his insult.
most absurdly, it says
Most
third era is
absurdly.
that of David of Dinant, who most absurdly taught that God was primary matter, that God himself was the prime matter.
Yeah. Calm
Uh,
down, Thomas.
yeah, he's like, you could just see he's like frothing at the mouth.
Just fuming right now. Um, I think that's pretty important because I think a lot of theology, a lot of people kind of talk as if God is reliant upon us to be who he is, and we kind of like fill him up. And it's like, well, that's not true. I mean, God is life itself. He's the fullness of overabundance life. And we exist because he is life itself. It's not because he needs us to fill him up. It's because he's good and does good. I think that Bible verse is really important. He's good and does good. That's just who he is. He
Yeah.
doesn't need to become good, and we don't make him better. I have to go. Should we leave the end here? Okay, bye. I
Sorry,
gotta hit
sorry,
stop.
we talked too long at the beginning, I think.